Elijah Boone had not spoken to a soul in 5 years. Not since the day the earth swallowed his wife and the laughter went silent. The land he lived on was vast miles of wheat, sagebrush, and rusted fences under the same pale sky. But for all its space, it had never felt so small since her absence. When Clara died taken by a fever that came too fast and stayed too long, Elijah didn't bury just her body. He buried his voice, his music, and whatever softness remained in him. He lived in silence, not because no one came to visit, but because he had nothing left to say. The farmhouse they'd built together stood upright, though time tugged at its beams and storms whispered through its cracks. Paint peeled, shutters hung crooked, but Elijah maintained the roof and patched the windows, not out of pride, but necessity. Survival had become routine. Each day had a rhythm: rise at dawn, feed the chickens, walk the rows, tend the soil, fix what had fallen. He cooked only what he needed, and often less than that. A man alone didn't require much, and he liked it that way, or so he told himself. His land was 3 miles from the nearest dirt road and 10 from the edge of town, and no one ever came unless they were lost or desperate. Elijah never made himself easy to find. The mailbox had rusted shut. The sign that once bore his name had long since been taken by wind or rot. He had grown to like the silence, or at least accept it, the way some men accept bad weather or an aching knee. The only voices were those in his head. Clara's laugh when the coffee boiled over, her hum when she worked with dough, the sharp but loving way she'd say his name when he forgot to come in for supper. Those sounds stayed with him, looping endlessly, the ghost of comfort lingering just beyond reach. He never moved her rocking chair from the porch. He kept it angled toward the east, where the sun rose soft and orange across the wheat. He never sat in it. That chair was hers, even now, especially now. When storms rolled in across the prairie, Elijah sat at the window and watched them come. Thunder no longer stirred anything in him. Lightning reminded him of her funeral, the way it cracked the sky wide open, just as the minister lowered her into the earth. He didn't pray anymore, not out of spite, but exhaustion. He had once believed God lived in the kindness between people, in a warm meal, or a child's giggle. But what God took a woman like Clara and left men like Holloway walking free. The barn still stood, though he'd let the north wall sag. He didn't keep livestock anymore, beyond a few chickens and a stubborn mule named Dust. Elijah had sold the cattle when the drought came, and with no family left to help, he had no desire to raise a herd alone. Dust was quiet, like him, and didn't ask for more than oats and shelter. They got along fine. Sometimes Elijah talked to the mule not with words, but through routine. A pat on the neck, a bucket lowered just so. Dust understood. The piano inside the farmhouse had once been the soul of the home. Clara had played every Sunday, evening hymns and old folk songs and even the occasional rowdy saloon tune just to make him laugh. After she passed, Elijah covered it with a sheet and never touched it again. The keys remained frozen in time, untouched, unsung. He couldn't bear the sound of it. Not without her. No one from town came out anymore. The neighbors had moved or died. A few letters came during the first year, offering condolences, church invitations, or reminders about taxes. He never answered. Eventually, the letters stopped. Elijah didn't mind. The quiet was simpler than explaining grief. The world didn't owe him anything. He asked for nothing in return. And then came the 6th autumn. The clouds began gathering, thick and dark as iron, whispering warnings across the field. The air changed. The animals grew restless. Elijah, sitting alone on the porch, didn't know it yet, but his silence was about to be broken. And the world beyond his fence was already moving toward him, fast. It began with the wind. Not the usual prairie gusts that brushed the wheat in slow waves or rustled through the eaves like an old friend passing through. This wind had bite-sharp, sudden, twisting. It came from the east, unnatural and fast, turning the wheat fields from golden sea to anxious skin. Elijah Boone stood at the edge of his porch with one hand resting on a worn beam, staring out over the land as the first hint of storm made itself known. He squinted into the distance. The sky didn't just darken, it boiled. Storms were nothing new to Elijah. He had weathered all kinds: blizzards that froze the breath, dust storms that swallowed barns whole, and lightning that set dry grass ablaze. But this was different. The clouds churned like something alive. They weren't drifting, and they were crawling, pulsing, building themselves into a wall of fury. Even the animals felt it. Dust the mule kicked at his stall nervously. The hens had gone quiet, and the hawks that usually circled above had vanished, as if they wanted no part in what was coming. Elijah moved slowly, methodically. He was a man of routines, and emergencies didn't change that. He went to the barn and checked the doors, hammered loose boards where he could, stacked sandbags in front of the henhouse, and covered the feed. He secured the windows with thick planks and drew the lanterns out from the cellar. For a man who hadn't spoken in years, he still knew how to listen. And everything around him or there, animal was screaming, "Brace yourself." But even as he worked, something tugged at his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not about the storm, but about something else. A sense that this storm was not just made of wind and water. It felt like a prelude, like a curtain being drawn before the play, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He looked to the tree line. In the distance, that black-green wall that marked the edge of his world. Nothing moved. No deer, no foxes, not even birds. That was unnatural. Every creature on the land had already taken cover, and that's when the sound came not from the sky, but from the road that cut along the back of the property. A dull, rhythmic clatter, hooves, but not from any wild beast. Too many feet, uneven pace, like people running on broken paths. Elijah's back stiffened. He grabbed his old lantern and stepped off the porch, walking toward the gate with a slow, wary stride. The last time anyone had come up that trail was during the second winter, after Claridida lost Preacher looking for a boy who'd gone missing in the hills. But this didn't sound like one lost traveler. It sounded like a group dot, and then the knock came. 3 sharp raps against his front door, hard, fast, and full of urgency. Elijah turned, startled. He hadn't seen anyone cross the yard. No wagon, trats, no shouting. But the knock was real. Dust whinnied from the barn. The sky let out a long, low groan. He stepped back onto the porch, lantern held high, and opened the door. What stood before him wasn't a traveler, or a salesman, or a preacher. It was a young woman, no older than 30, soaked from the storm, that had only just begun to spit. Her shawl clung to her skin, her hair matted and wild. Behind her stood 5 others different ages, some younger, some older, all wet, dirty, and terrified. Their faces were cut by briars. One woman held a small child bundled in rags. Another limped, her arms slung awkwardly. The leader looked at him squarely, though her voice trembled. "Please," she said. "We didn't know where else to go." Elijah stared at them, silent as stone. "We're running," she added. "They're coming. The storm's close, but they're worse." The wind howled past the house then, as if on cue, tearing leaves from the trees and rattling every window. Elijah didn't speak. He stepped aside, lantern still in hand, and held the door open. The 6 women and the child moved past him quickly, without questions, without thanks, just fear. Elijah closed the door behind them. The house groaned as the storm pressed down on the roof. Outside, the thunder was just beginning, but whatever chased those women, it was closer than the clouds. The warmth inside the farmhouse felt sudden and strange. The 6 women stood in the entryway like shadows, unsure of where to land, dripping rain onto Elijah's wood floors. The lantern in his hand cast their faces in a wavering amber glow, revealing exhaustion, dirt, and fear etched into every line of their expressions. For a long moment, no one moved. The women seemed to sense that they were in the presence of something rare, a man who had not spoken in years, in a silence that wasn't just around him, but part of him. Elijah set the lantern on a side table, and began to stoke the fire, which had died to embers. His hands were steady, though his mind swirled with questions. Who were they? Where had they come from? And perhaps, most importantly, who were they running from? He didn't ask. He didn't have to. The storm outside was growing teeth now, lashing at the windows and forcing wind through every crevice. The women peeled off their wet coats and shawls, slowly, revealing worn dresses, bruised limbs, and skin scraped raw from brambles. One woman, the oldest, with streaks of silver in her braids, guided the youngest to sit on the couch. She held the child tightly, her hand trembling only slightly as she brushed wet hair from the girl's forehead. The leader of the group, the one who had not stood tall, despite the fatigue in her bones. Her name, Elijah would later learn, was Lottie. At that moment, she didn't offer names or explanations. She simply said, "Thank you." 2 words. And for Elijah, they seemed to echo in his ears longer than they should have. He hadn't heard another voice inside this house in 5 years. Clara's piano stood untouched behind the women. The rocking chair was still angled toward the window. This sudden shift from silence to 7 strangers breathing in his home was jarring, but he didn't let it show. He simply nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. He returned with towels, a dry blanket, and a steaming pot of broth he had been preparing earlier. The women accepted everything without question. Lottie helped pass the bowls around, while the youngest girl leaned against the fire, eyes closing slowly. No one said much, but the way they looked at Elijah was telling, not with suspicion, but with disbelief, as if they hadn't expected kindness from a man in the middle of nowhere, as if they'd thought the door would stay closed. After some time, Lottie pulled a chair closer to the fire and finally spoke. "We came from Winton's Mill," she said, her voice low but steady. "Tried to stay ahead of the storm. Didn't plan on stopping, but the men came early. We lost track of time running." She looked up at him then. "Some of them heard us." Elijah stared into the fire, unmoving. The name Winton's Mill stirred something in him, distant memories of trade posts, bad whiskey, and worse men. He'd heard rumors years ago that the area had fallen under the control of a group of driftersmen who wore no badges and followed no laws. He knew the type, the kind who saw unprotected women as easy prey. Lottie continued, her tone hardening. "We're trying to get to Meriton Ridge. Heard they're taking in families, but the rain started too fast. The wagon broke, we went on foot after that." The woman with the limp nodded silently. The others listened, but didn't interrupt. Elijah rose and walked to the front window, brushing aside the curtain. Lightning flared in the distance, followed by the rumble of thunder and the ghost of movement along the tree line. He couldn't be sure, but something or someone was out there. He stepped away and opened the hall closet. Inside was an old trunk. From it, he pulled 2 thick quilts, a worn wool jacket, and, carefully, an iron shotgun. Lottie's eyes followed his movements but didn't flinch. She didn't ask what he saw. She didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It had shifted, become something shared. A language between 2 people who understood that not all danger came from the sky. Elijah turned back toward the room, the firelight flickering behind him. He still hadn't spoken a word, but in the way he moved, deliberate, sure, protective, it was clear. These women weren't just taking shelter from the weather. They were now under his roof, and he intended to keep them safe. The wind beat against the house like a wild drum, pressing harder with each hour. By nightfall, the farmhouse felt like a ship caught in a rising sea, its wooden frame creaking and groaning with every gust. Inside, the fire held back the chill, but no one truly felt warm. Lottie sat near the window now, staring into the storm, her jaw clenched. Elijah, silent as ever, moved through the house with a steady rhythm, checking locks, reinforcing the barn door, handing out dry bread and boiled potatoes without a word. The women followed his movements with quiet eyes. There was a growing sense that this house, long left untouched by other souls, had suddenly come alive. But that feeling of uneasy peace was fractured shortly after dusk. It began with a sound, soft, distant, nearly lost in the storm. A branch snapping, a loose shutter. Lottie leaned forward from her seat by the window, eyes narrowing. Elijah was already on his feet. Without looking at anyone, he grabbed a lantern and opened the front door, just a crack, letting in a gust of rain-soaked air and the sharp smell of wet earth. The flame flickered, barely holding. He stepped onto the porch. The wind rushed past him like a freight train, flinging droplets across his face and pulling at his long coat. He scanned the yard, squinting into the darkness. The lantern's glow reached only so far, illuminating the rocking chair, the muddy path, and a few feet beyond the gate. Nothing. But then, just as he turned to go back inside, he saw it, a footprint. Not a boot print. This was heavier, deeper, sliding in the mud as if whoever made it had stumbled. It was recent, fresh, and it wasn't alone. Elijah followed them with his eyes, and they continued along the side of the house, disappearing behind the corner toward the barn. He went back inside and closed the door quietly. The room was still. All eyes were on him. He didn't say anything. He simply locked the door, lowered the lantern light, and turned to Lottie. She stood, her voice low. "Someone out there." Elijah gave the faintest nod. The silver-haired woman holding the child drew the girl closer. Another of the younger women started weeping silently into her palms. Lottie, meanwhile, looked to Elijah and whispered, "How many?" He paused, then held up 2 fingers. 2 men, maybe scouts, maybe worse. Lottie cursed under her breath and turned to the women. "Pack your things quietly. Don't ask questions." They began to move swiftly, grabbing shawls, shoes, satchels. Elijah disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he carried a long leather bag. He set it on the kitchen table and unrolled it with care. Inside were tools from another life. A revolver, ammunition, a hunting knife, a weather-worn compass, and a folded map. These were not the belongings of a recluse. They were the tools of a man who once moved through danger with purpose. The women stared at the weapons with wide eyes. Elijah checked the revolver, then tucked it under his coat. For a man who had lived in silence for years, there was no hesitation in his hands. Whatever quiet life he had built was now unraveling, and he knew exactly how to return to the part of himself that had once survived worse storms. Lottie approached him slowly. "We can run," she said. "We're fast. We'll take the back fields." Elijah shook his head. "You're staying?" she asked. He nodded. "To fight." He turned his gaze to the window, and then back to her. This time, it was more than a nod. He placed his hand on the map and tapped a spot, a narrow ridge behind the house, sheltered by cedar trees and thorny underbrush. Lottie understood. He would buy them time. The room fell quiet once more as thunder cracked like cannon fire in the distance. The child began to cry softly, muffled by her grandmother's arms. The storm had reached its full fury now, but it was no longer the greatest threat. Outside, in the dark, 2 shadows crept around the edge of the barn, silent, hunting. Unaware that the man inside the farmhouse was no simple farmer, he was something else. The wind was still howling when Elijah stepped out the back door. He closed it behind him with the softest click, leaving the lantern light behind. Rain hammered the earth in thick sheets. Every step he took was measured, boots sinking into the mud, but his eyes were sharp and alert, scanning for movement. His breath fogged in the cold air, but he barely noticed it. Somewhere in the dark, 2 men were circling the house. maybe more. But Elijah wasn't afraid, not of them, and not of the storm. He slipped into the tree line beyond the barn, moving like a ghost between wet trunks and shifting shadows. The revolver sat heavy in his coat, but his fingers remained loose, steady. He hadn't touched a gun in years, hadn't needed to, but muscle memory, like guilt, never left. As he crept along the ridge he'd shown Lottie on the map, he scanned the lower yard. Then he saw them, barely more than shapes, but unmistakable. Two figures crouched near the west side of the house, one with a lantern, the other cradling a rifle like it was an extension of his arm. They were waiting for something. Or someone. Elijah crouched behind a fallen log, the bark soaked and cold beneath his hands. His eyes narrowed. These weren't just vagrants or men caught in the storm. Their boots were polished, gear well packed, weapons clean. These were hired men. Trackers, maybe raiders at worst, sent after the women either for bounty or blood. Elijah pulled his coat tighter and eased the revolver from his belt. He didn't want to fire, not unless he had to. Not unless there were no other options. But if they came for the women, he'd give them nothing but silence and lead. Then, just ahead, one of the men moved toward the barn. He raised his hand and gave a soft whistle, the kind used by hunters to signal a position. A third figure emerged from the trees. Elijah froze. 3 now, maybe more coming. Inside the house, Lottie moved fast. She had the women crouched low, bags packed, every candle blown out. The fire was down to embers. The youngest girl sat with her hands clamped over her ears. Lottie kept one eye on the back door, heart racing. Every instinct told her to run, but she waited for Elijah. Then she saw it, a flash of light outside the rear window. Movement, a hand, not Elijah's. She sprang to her feet. Go now, she whispered, through the root cellar. The women followed without hesitation. The silver-haired one lifted the child into her arms. They disappeared into the small hallway, opened the cellar door, and vanished into the ground. Just as the back door began to creak open, but Elijah wasn't far. From his vantage point, he'd seen the third man reach the porch. The moment his foot touched the step, Elijah moved, fast, silent. He crossed the yard in a crouch, slipped around the far side, and struck hard one clean blow with the butt of the revolver to the man's skull. The raider crumpled to the mud. Without a sound, the second man heard nothing. He stepped into the barn, checking stalls, peering into shadows. Elijah followed like a shadow himself, boots quiet on straw. When the second man turned around, the muzzle of Elijah's revolver was already pressed against his chest. His eyes went wide, but before he could raise a hand, Elijah pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. Lottie flinched inside the cellar. The women gasped, trembling, but they stayed hidden, waited. Back outside, the third man, the one with the lantern, spun toward the sound. Elijah was already running, heart pounding but mind clear. He disappeared behind the chicken coop, cut across the woodpile, and circled around again. By the time the third man reached the barn, Elijah was behind him. Another blow. This one, he didn't get back up. 3 down. No voices, no questions. Elijah stood in the rain, revolver lowered, breathing hard. He didn't know if more were coming. He didn't care. What mattered was simple. They had come to take. He had something to protect, and he wasn't done yet. By dawn, the storm had broken. Clouds hung low like bruises in the sky, and the wind, once howling with menace, now whispered across the fields. The earth was soaked, the barn roof slick with rain, the mud streaked with boot tracks and blood. Elijah stood near the edge of the ridge, staring across the soaked valley, revolver still in his grip. His coat clung to him, rain-drenched and heavy, but he hadn't moved in what felt like hours. Behind him, the sun cast a pale orange glow over the landscape, revealing 3 unconscious men, stashed behind the barn and the long, quiet path the women had taken into the hills. He didn't chase after them. He didn't need to. They were safe now, or safer than they'd been when they arrived. Lottie had left him a note, scrawled on a torn scrap of flour sack, weighted down with a tin button on the kitchen table. It said only, "You didn't have to do it, but you did. We won't forget." It was the first writing he'd seen in that house that wasn't from his own hand. He stepped inside again, boots tracking wet earth across the floor. The room looked almost the same, but not quite. The fire had died completely. The tea kettle sat forgotten. The women had taken nothing but their coats and what little food they could carry. Still, their presence lingered like breath on a mirror, faint but real. For the first time in years, Elijah wasn't alone. Even if the house was empty, he walked to the front window and opened the curtains just slightly. The land rolled out. Before him, vast and quiet. For so long, he had lived in silence, not because he loved it, but because he feared what he might become again if he stepped into the world. He had been a soldier once, a rider, a man who could track a target through dust and bush, who could kill without flinching. And when the war ended, when the contracts dried up, he'd tried to leave that man behind. He bought this farmhouse with coin he never explained, and buried the past in his fields. He planted corn where once he'd spilled blood, let the calluses return to his hands from work instead of war. But violence had a way of remembering you, even when you'd forgotten yourself. Elijah sat now at the kitchen table, hands stained from the night's work, the revolver lying before him like an old, unwelcome friend. He poured water into a tin mug and stared at it, as if it might offer penance. But water doesn't cleanse everything, especially not the soul. His gaze drifted to the coat hook by the door. 6 shawls had once hung there. Now there were none. Thought about the girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with hair tangled like wind-tossed grass and eyes too old for her face. She hadn't spoken once, but she had watched him the way prey watches the sky ready for wings and claws. And he'd seen something in her then, not fear, but recognition. She knew the look of a man who had done things people don't speak of when the sun's out. That girl had walked into his house with suspicion. But when they'd left, when the shooting had started, she hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. She'd held her grandmother's hand, stared back at him, and nodded once. Like they understood each other. That was what stayed with Elijah, now not the blood, not the gunfire, but the nod of a child who'd seen too much and understood without words that monsters can protect, too. A creak pulled him from his thoughts. He turned. Lottie stood in the doorway. Her shawl was drenched. Mud streaked her hem. "We made it to the river," she said quietly. "I sent the others on with the boatman. Told them to keep heading west." Elijah didn't answer. He waited. "I came back because I figured you'd bury them," she added, glancing toward the barn. "Didn't seem right to let you do it alone." For the first time in years, Elijah spoke. His voice was gravel and ash. "Thank you," she nodded. "Let's get started before the sun climbs too high." He rose slowly, revolver still on the table, but he didn't take it this time. As they stepped outside into the broken morning, something had shifted. He had defended, he had endured, but now he was beginning to return. Elijah picked up the spade from where it leaned against the barn. The wood was worn smooth by years of use, first in planting, later in maintenance. Today, it would be used for something older, something heavier. Rain still clung to the leaves. The morning air crisp and thick with the scent of wet soil and gunpowder. Lottie stood quietly nearby, holding a shovel of her own. Neither spoke as they walked behind the barn, boots sinking into the soft mud. The 3 men Elijah had laid out were covered with canvas tarps, stripped from the stable wall, their bodies arranged in a row near the fence line, away from the fields. "Do you know who they were?" she asked softly. Elijah shook his head. "No, but someone sent them." Lottie didn't ask who. They both knew it didn't matter. These men weren't the last, just the latest, and trouble especially for women like Lottie and her group didn't disappear with a single gunfight. What mattered now was the act of burial, a final boundary, a line drawn in wet earth that said, this far, no further. They worked in silence. The rhythm of the digging became its own kind of prayer. Elijah struck deep with every thrust, muscles aching with memory and purpose. He had dug graves before on battlefields, beside railroads, on forgotten plains where names never lasted. But this was different. This was his land, his soil. These were not strangers, fallen in a distant war. They had come here, to his gate. Lottie dug beside him without complaint. She had a strength that didn't show in posture but in resolve. The wind tugged at her damp hair, her breath steady. Every few minutes, she stopped to glance toward the hills, as if expecting something or someone. "You think they'll send more?" Elisha asked, not looking up. "Maybe, if they find out what happened here." She paused, then added, "One of the women Rose used to belong to a man who didn't let go easy. He might have been the one who sent these 3. Elijah grunted. "Then he'll send worse." Lottie met his eyes. "I know." They lowered the first body into the grave. Elijah didn't speak over it. He didn't say a prayer. The man had brought death and found it. That was all. As they covered him with earth, Elijah's shoulders sagged, just slightly not from guilt, but from the weight of years that seemed to press down harder now. By midday, all 3 men were buried. No markers, no stones, just 3 mounds near the fence and the low whistle of wind through the trees. Elijah rested against the shovel, wiping his brow with his sleeve. Lottie sat on a stump, watching him. "You could have let us go that first night," she said. "Turned us away, shut the door like most would have. I almost did. But you didn't." He looked at her now, really looked. There was something unspoken in her expression, part admiration, part grief. "I saw the girl," he said. "She reminded me, of someone." Elijah nodded. "Of someone who didn't get a second chance." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was respectful, like 2 people sharing the edge of an old wound. Finally, Lottie stood. "You don't owe us anything, Elijah. You've already given more than most would. You're not staying. I have to catch up to them. Rose and the others, they'll need someone who can read a map and make a fire. You sure you're not the one who needs them?" She smiled. "Maybe, but I think we all need something." He hesitated. "You come back through these parts again, I'll knock," she promised. Same as before. Elijah watched her disappear down the trail, her steps quiet, certain. He stood in the middle of his land, his fence repaired, the storm gone, the graves still fresh behind him. The wind shifted, the sun climbed higher. He had buried men today, but something else had been unearthed. Something old, something vital. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, Elijah knew this much. He had been alone for a long time, but maybe not for much longer. That evening, long after Lottie's footsteps had faded into the hills and the sun dipped behind the ridge, Elijah sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. The quiet no longer felt so heavy. It wasn't the hollow silence that had once filled the house like smoke. It was the kind of silence that comes after a hymn, after a story told, after a life spared. The storm was gone, but the wind still curled through the grass like it remembered. Cattle lowed gently in the far pasture, distant silhouettes moving under a silver sky. And near the base of the trail, where boots had once trampled recklessly, Elijah had hung a length of rawhide over a post tied in a single knot, like the old signs of peace from long ago. He didn't know who might see it. He didn't care. It wasn't for them, it was for him. It was for him. Inside the house, things had changed in small ways. A second cup sat beside his own. The fire burned slower, but it burned nonetheless. The shawl Lottie had forgotten still hung over the back of the rocking chair, the fabric smelling faintly of smoke and sage. On the kitchen table, her note remained untouched. You didn't have to do it, but you did. We won't forget. The weight of those words grew heavier the longer they lingered. Not because he needed gratitude, but because he'd once believed he was beyond redemption. And now, 6 women had come into his home and left behind more than just footprints. They'd brought the world back in. He thought of the girl again. The youngest one, with her quiet eyes and scraped knees. She had not said a single word during her stay, but her stare had spoken volumes. She had trusted him enough to sleep under his roof, to eat his bread, to hold her grandmother's hand beside his fire. That trust, unspoken and brittle, was something he hadn't realized he was hungry for. Not until it was offered. He didn't know where they were headed. Lottie had mentioned the Colorado border, maybe farther west. She said they'd heard of a settlement run by former nurses and teachers. Women like them, women who had left dangerous men or dangerous lives and were building something of their own. A place with rules, with safety, a place where a girl could grow up without needing to be hard. Elijah hoped they'd make it, and if not, he hoped they'd remember that one small house in the middle of nowhere where they'd been safe if only for one night. The next morning, he got up before the sun. His body ached in familiar places, but his hands were steady. He boiled water for coffee, fed the animals, and walked the perimeter of the property. Everything felt sharper, more alive. He noticed tracks along the eastern fence, hoofprints from cattle, but from horses, and not just one. Perhaps 5, maybe 6, carefully spaced, not rushed. Someone had passed through during the night, or perhaps circled, watching, but they had not come to the door. He smiled. There were rumors, even out here, of a growing number of riders who patrolled the high country, former warriors, Apache and Navajo alike, who had grown tired of seeing women and children hunted like deer. Lottie might have known one of them. She might have summoned them in her own way, or maybe Elijah's gesture, his defense of her and the others had echoed farther than he realized. One act, one open door. He walked back inside, sat at the table, and reached for the folded paper she'd left him. Not the note, but the one under it. A map. She'd drawn a rough trail. From his land to the river, then westward. A dotted line, and at the end, just 2 words. Come someday. He traced the path with his finger. He could see himself riding again, not as the man who once fought for money or vengeance, but as someone new, or maybe someone old, uncovered. The wind tapped lightly at the window. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Elijah Granger began to pack. Not because he needed to run, but because he finally had somewhere to go.